Studies in Ethnomethodology, 1967, Harold Garfinkel. For Kant, the moral order within was an awesome mystery. For sociologists, the moral order without is a technical mystery. From the point of view of sociological theory, the moral order consistent of the rule governed activities of everyday life. A society's members encounters and know the moral order as perceivedly normal courses of action, familiar scenes of everyday affairs, the world of daily life known in common with others and with others taken for granted. They refer to this world as the natural facts of life, which, for members, are through and through moral facts of life. For members, not only are matters so about familiar scenes, but they are so because it is morally right or wrong that they are so. Familiar scenes of everyday activities, treated by members as the natural facts of life, are massive facts of the members' daily existence, both as a real world and as the product of activities in the real world. They furnish the fix that this is it, to which the waking state returns one, and are the points of departure and return for every modification of the world of daily life that is achieved in play, dreaming, trance, theater, scientific theorizing, or high ceremony. In every discipline, humanistic or scientific, the familiar common sense world of everyday life is a matter of abiding interest. In the social sciences, and in sociology particularly, it is a matter of essential preoccupation. It makes up sociology's problematic subject matter, enters the very constitution of the sociological attitude, and exercises an odd and obstinate sovereignty over sociologists' claims to adequate explanation. Despite the topic's centrality, an immense literature contains little data and few methods with which the essential features of socially recognized familiar scenes may be detected and related to dimensions of social organization. Although sociologists take socially structured scenes of everyday life as a point of departure they rarely see, a task of sociological inquiry in its own right, the general question of how any such common sense world is possible. Instead, the possibility of the everyday world is either settled by theoretical representation or merely assumed. As a topic and methodological ground for sociological inquiries, the definition of the common sense world of everyday life, though it is appropriately a project of sociological inquiry, has been neglected. My purposes in this paper are to demonstrate the essential relevance to sociological inquiries of a concern for common sense activities as a topic of inquiry in its own right, and, by reporting a series of studies, to urge its rediscovery. Making commonplace scenes visible. In accounting for the stable features of everyday activities, sociologists commonly select familiar settings such as familial households or workplaces and ask for the variables that contribute to their stable features. Just as commonly, one set of considerations are unexamined, the socially standardized and standardizing, seen but unnoticed, expected background features of everyday scenes. The member of the society uses background expectancies as a scheme of interpretation. With their use, actual appearances are for him recognizable and intelligible as the appearances of familiar events. Demonstrably, he is responsive to this background, while at the same time he is at a loss to tell us specifically of what the expectancies consist. When we ask him about them, he has little or nothing to say. For these background expectancies to come into view, one must either be a stranger to the life as usual character of everyday scenes, or become estranged from them. As Alfred Schutz pointed out, a special motive is required to make them problematic. In the sociologist's case, this special motive consists in the programmatic task of treating a societal member's practical circumstances, which include from the member's point of view the morally necessary character of many of its background features, as matters of theoretic interest. The seen but unnoticed backgrounds of everyday activities are made visible and are described from a perspective in which persons live out the lives they do, have the children they do, feel the feelings, think the thoughts, enter the relationships they do, all in order to permit the sociologist to solve his theoretical problems. Almost alone among sociological theorists, the late Alfred Schutz, in a series of classical studies of the constitutive phenomenology of the world of everyday life, described many of these seen but unnoticed background expectancies. He called them the attitude of daily life. He referred to their scenic attributions as the world known in common and taken for granted. Schutz's fundamental work makes it possible to pursue further the tasks of clarifying their nature and operation, of relating them to the processes of concerted actions, and assigning them their place in an empirically imaginable society. The studies reported in this paper attempt to detect some expectancies that lend commonplace scenes their familiar, life-as-usual character, and to relate these to the stable social structures of everyday activities. Procedurally, it is my preference to start with familiar scenes and ask what can be done to make trouble. The operations that one would have to perform in order to multiply the senseless features of perceived environments, to produce and sustain bewilderment, consternation, and confusion, to produce the socially structured effects of anxiety, shame, guilt, and indignation, and to produce disorganized interaction should tell us something about how the structures of everyday activities are ordinarily and routinely produced and maintained. A word of reservation. Despite their procedural emphasis, my studies are not properly speaking experimental. They are demonstrations designed, in Herbert Spielberg's phrase, as aids to a sluggish imagination. I have found that they produce reflections through which the strangeness of an obstinately familiar world can be detected. Background understandings and adequate recognition of commonplace events. What kinds of expectancies make up a seen but unnoticed background of common understandings, and how are they related to persons' recognition of stable courses of interpersonal transactions? Some information can be obtained if we first ask how a person will look at an ordinary and familiar scene, and what will he see in it if we require of him that he do more than look at it as something that for him it obviously and really is not. Undergraduate students were assigned to the task of spending from 15 minutes to an hour in their homes, viewing its activities while assuming that they were boarders in the household. They were instructed not to act out the assumption. 33 students reported their experiences. In their written reports, students behaviorized the household scenes. Here is an excerpt from one account to illustrate my meaning. A short, stout man entered the house, kissed me on the cheek, and asked, "How was school?" I answered politely. He walked into the kitchen, kissed the younger of the two women, and said hello to the other. The younger woman asked me, "What do you want for dinner, honey?" I answered nothing. She shrugged her shoulders and said no more. The older woman shuffled around the kitchen muttering. The man washed his hands, sat down on the table, and picked up the paper. He read until the two women had finished putting the food on the table. The three sat down. They exchanged idle chatter about the day's events. The older woman said something in a foreign language which made the others laugh. Persons, relationships, and activities were described without respect for their history, for the place of the scene in a set of developing life circumstances, or for the scenes as texture of relevant events for the parties themselves. References to motives, propriety, subjectivity generally, and the socially standardized character of the events were omitted. Descriptions might be thought of as those of a keyhole observer who puts aside much of what he knows in common with subjects about the scenes he is looking at, as if the writer had witnessed the scenes under a mild amnesia for his common-sense knowledge of social structures. Students were surprised to see the ways in which members' treatments of each other were personal. The business of one was treated as the business of the others. A person being criticized was unable to stand on dignity and was prevented by the others from taking offense. One student reported her surprise at how freely she had the run of the house. Displays of conduct and feeding and feeling occurred without a parent's concern for the management of impressions. Table manners were bad, and family members showed each other little politeness. An early causality in the scene was the family news of the day, which turned into trivial talk. Students reported that this way of looking was difficult to sustain. Familiar objects, persons obviously, but furniture and room arrangements as well, resisted students' efforts to think of themselves as strangers. Many became uncomfortably aware of how habitual movements were being made, of how one was handling the silverware, or how one opened a door or greeted another member. Many reported that the attitude was difficult to sustain because with it, quarreling, bickering, and hostile motivations became discomfitingly visible. Frequently, an account that recited newly visible troubles was accompanied by the student's assertion that his account of family problems was not a true picture. The family was really a very happy one. Several students reported a mildly oppressive feeling of conforming to a part. Several students attempted to formulate the real me as activities governed by rules of conduct but gave it up as a bad job. They found it more convincing to think of themselves in usual circumstances as being one's real self. Nevertheless, one student was intrigued with how deliberately and successfully he could predict the other's responses to his actions. He was not troubled by this feeling. Many accounts reported a variation on the theme. I was glad when the hour was up and I could return to the real me. Students were convinced that the view from the boarder's attitude was not the real home environment. The boarder's attitude produced appearances which they discounted as interesting incongruities of little and misleading practical import. How had the familiar ways of looking at their home environments been altered? How did their looking differ from usual? Several contrasts to the usual and required way of looking are detectable from their accounts. 1. In looking at their homes as boarders, they replaced the mutually recognized texture of events with a rule of interpretation which required that this mutual texture be temporarily disregarded. 2. The mutually recognized texture was brought under the jurisdiction of the new attitude as a definition of the essential structures of this texture. 3. This was done by engaging in interaction with others with an attitude whose nature and purpose only the user knew about. That remained undisclosed. That could be either adopted or put aside at a time of the user's own choosing, and was a matter of willful election. 4. The attitude as an intention was sustained as a matter of personal and willed compliance with an explicit and single rule. 5. In which, like a game, the goal of the intention was identical with looking at things under the auspices of the single rule itself. 6. Above all, looking was not bound by any necessity for gearing one's interest within the attitude to the actions of others. These were the matters that students found strange. When students used these background expectancies not only as ways of looking at familial scenes but as grounds for acting in them, the scenes exploded with the bewilderment and the anger of family members. In another procedure, students were asked to spend from 15 minutes to an hour in their homes imagining that they were boarders and acting out this assumption. They were instructed to conduct themselves in a circumspect and polite fashion. They were to avoid getting personal, to use formal address, to speak only when spoken to. In 9 of 49 cases, students either refused to do the assignment, 5 cases, or the try was unsuccessful, 4 cases. 4 of the no-try students said they were afraid to do it. A 5th said she preferred to avoid the risk of exciting her mother who had a heart condition. In 2 of the unsuccessful cases, the family treated it as a joke from the beginning and refused, despite the continuing actions of the student, to change. A 3rd family took the view that something undisclosed was the matter, but what it might be was of no concern to them. In the 4th family, the father and mother remarked that the daughter was being extra nice and undoubtedly wanted something that she would shortly reveal. In the remaining 4/5 of the cases, family members were stupefied. They vigorously sought to make the strange actions intelligible and to restore the situation to normal appearances. Reports were filled with accounts of astonishment, bewilderment, shock, anxiety, embarrassment, and anger, and with charges by various family members that the student was mean, inconsiderate, selfish, nasty, or impolite. Family members demanded explanations. What's the matter? What's gotten into you? Did you get fired? Are you sick? Why are you being so superior? What are you being so superior about? Why are you mad? Are you out of your mind or are you just stupid? One student acutely embarrassed his mother in front of her friends by asking if she minded if he had a snack from the refrigerator. Mind if you have a little mind if you have a little snack? You've been eating little snacks around here for years without asking me what's gotten into you. One mother, infuriated when her daughter spoke to her only when she was spoken to, began to shriek in angry denunciation of the daughter for her disrespect and insubordination, and refused to be calmed by the student's sister. A father berated his daughter for being insufficiently concerned for the welfare of others and of acting like a spoiled child. Occasionally, family members would first treat the student's action as a cue for a joint comedy routine, which was soon replaced by irritation and exasperated anger at the student for not knowing when enough was enough. Family members mocked the politeness of the students, certainly Mr. Hertzberg, or charged the student with acting like a wise guy, and generally reproved the politeness with sarcasm. Explanations were sought in previous, understandable motives of the student. The student was working too hard in school. The student was ill. There had been another fight with a fiancé. When offered explanations by family members went unacknowledged, there followed withdrawal by the offended member, attempted isolation of the culprit, retaliation, and denunciation. Don't bother with him. He is in one of his moods again. Pay no attention, but just wait until he asks me for something. You're cutting me. Okay, I'll cut you and then some. Why must you always create friction in our family harmony? Many accounts reported versions of the following confrontation. A father followed his son into the bedroom. Your mother's right. You don't look well and you're not talking sense. You had better get another job that doesn't require such late hours. To this, the student replied that he appreciated the consideration, but that he felt fine and only wanted a little privacy. The father responded in a high rage. I don't want any more of that out of you, and if you can't treat your mother decently, you'd better move out. There were no cases in which the situation was not restorable upon the student's explanation. Nevertheless, for the most part, family members were not amused, and only rarely did they find the experience instructive, as the student argued that it was supposed to have been. After hearing the explanation, a sister replied coldly on behalf of a family of 4, "Please, no more of these experiments. We're not rats, you know." Occasionally, an explanation was accepted, but still it added offense. In several cases, students reported that the explanations left them, their families, or both wondering how much of what the student had said was in character, and how much the student really meant. Students found the assignment difficult to complete, but in contrast with onlookers' accounts, students were likely to report that difficulties consisted in not being treated as if they were in the role that they were attempting to play, and of being confronted with situations but not knowing how a boarder would respond. There were several entirely unexpected findings. 1. Although many students reported extensive rehearsals in imagination, very few mentioned anticipatory fears or embarrassment. 2. On the other hand, although unanticipated and nasty developments frequently occurred, in only one case did a student report serious regrets. 3. Very few students reported heartfelt relief when the hour was over. They were much more likely to report partial relief. They frequently reported that in response to the anger of others, they became angry in return and slipped easily into subjectively recognizable feelings and actions. In contrast to the reports of the onlooking boarders, very few reports behaviorized the scene. Background understandings and social effects. Despite the interest in social effects that prevails in the social sciences, and despite the extensive concern that clinical psychiatry pays them, surprisingly little has been written on the socially structured conditions for their production. The role that a background of common understandings plays in their production, control, and recognition is, however, almost terra incognita. This lack of attention from experimental investigators is all the more remarkable if one considers that it is precisely this relationship that persons are concerned with in their common sense portrayals of how to conduct one's daily affairs so as to solicit enthusiasm and friendliness or avoid anxiety, guilt, shame, or boredom. The relationship between the common understandings and social effects may be illustrated by thinking of the acting out student boarders procedure as one that involved the production of bewilderment and anger by treating an important state of affairs as something that is obviously, naturally, and really is not. The existence of a definite and strong relationship between common understandings and social effects can be demonstrated and some of its features explored by the deliberate display of distrust, a procedure that for us produced highly standardized effects. The rationale was as follows. One of the background expectancies Schutz described concerns the sanctioned use of doubt as a constituent feature of a world that is being understood in common. Schutz proposed that for the conduct of his everyday affairs, the person assumes the other person assumes as well, and assumes that as he assumes it of the other person assumes it of him, that a relationship of undoubted correspondence is the sanctioned relationship between the actual appearances of an object and the intended object that appears in a particular way. For the person conducting his everyday affairs, objects, for him, as he expects for others, are as they appear to be. To treat this relationship under a rule of doubt requires that the necessity and motivation for such a rule be justified. We anticipated that because of the differing relationship of an exhibited rule of doubt, distrust, that the other person was as he appeared to be to the legitimate texture of common expectancies. There should be different affective states for the doubter and the doubted. On the part of the person distrusted, there should be the demand for justification, and when it was not forthcoming, as anyone could see, it could not be anger. For the experimenter, we expected embarrassment to result from the disparity, under the gaze of his victim, between the lesser thing that the experimenter's challenges of what anyone could see made him out to be and the competent person he with of what anyone could see made him out to be and the competent person he with others knew himself after all to be, but which the procedure required that he could not claim. Like Santayana's clock, this formulation was neither right nor wrong. Although the procedure produced what we anticipated, it also furnished us with and the experimenters with more than we had bargained for. Students were instructed to engage someone in conversation and to imagine and act on the assumption that what the other person was saying was directed by hidden motives which were his real ones. They were to assume that the other person was trying to trick them or mislead them. In only 2 of 35 accounts did students attempt the assignment with strangers. Most students were afraid that such a situation would get out of hand, so they selected friends, roommates, and family members. Even so, they reported considerable rehearsal and imagination, much review of possible consequences, and deliberate selections among persons. The attitude was difficult to sustain and carry through. Students reported acute awareness of being in an artificial game, of being unable to live the part, and of frequently being at a loss as to what to do next. In the course of listening to the other person, experimenters would lose sight of the assignment. One student spoke for several when she said she was unable to get any results because so much of her effort was directed to maintaining an attitude of distrust that she was unable to follow the conversation. She said she was unable to imagine how her fellow conversationalists might be deceiving her because they were talking about such inconsequential matters. With many students, the assumption that the other person was not what he appeared to be and was to be distrusted was the same as the attribution that the other person was angry with them and hated them. On the other hand, Many victims, although they complained that the student had no reason to be angry with him, offered unsolicited attempts at explanation and conciliation. When there was of no avail, when this was of no avail, there followed frank displays of anger and disgust. Anticipated and acute embarrassment swiftly materialized for the two students who attempted the procedure with strangers. After badgering a bus driver for assurances that the bus would pass the street that she wanted and receiving several assurances in return that indeed the bus did pass the street, the exasperated bus driver shouted so that all passengers overheard, "Look, lady, I told you once, didn't I? How many times do I have to tell you?" She reported, I shrank to the back of the bus to sink as low as I could in the seat. I had gotten a good case of cold feet, a flaming face, and a strong dislike for my assignment. There were very few reports of shame or embarrassment from students who tried it with friends and family. Instead, they were surprised, and so were we, to find, as one student reported, that once I started acting the role of a hated person, I actually came to feel someone hated, and by the time I left the table, I was quite angry. Even more surprising to us, many reported that they found the procedure enjoyable, and this included the real anger not only of others, but of their own. Although students' explanations easily restored most situations, some episodes turned serious and left a residue of disturbance for one or both parties that offered explanation did not resolve. This can be illustrated in the report of a student housewife who, at the conclusion of dinner and with some trepidation, questioned her husband about having worked late the night before and raised the question about his actually having played poker as he claimed on an evening of the week before. Without asking him what he had actually done, she indicated an explanation was called for. He replied sarcastically, "You seem to be uneasy about something. Do you know what it might be?" This conversation would no doubt make more sense if I knew too. She accused him of deliberately avoiding the subject, although the subject had not been mentioned. He insisted that she tell him what the subject was. When she did not say, he asked directly, "Okay, what's the joke?" Instead of replying, I gave him a long, hurt look. He became visibly upset, became very solicitous, gentle, and persuasive. In response, she acknowledged the experiment. He stalked off obviously unhappy, and for the remainder of the evening was sullen and suspicious. She, in the meanwhile, remained at the table, piqued and unsettled about the remarks that her statements had drawn forth about his not being bored at work. With all the insinuations it might or could mean, particularly the insinuation that she was not bored at work, but he was bored with her and at home. She wrote, "I was actually bothered by his remarks. I felt more upset and worried than he did throughout the experiment about how imperturbable he seemed to be." Neither one attempted nor wanted to discuss the matter further. The following day the husband confessed that he had been considerably disturbed and had the following reactions in this order: determination to remain calm, shock at his wife's suspicious nature, surprised to find that cheating on her was liable to be hard, a determination to make her figure out her own answers to her questions without any denial or help from him, extreme relief when the encounter was revealed to have been experimentally contrived, but finally a residue of uneasy feelings, which he characterized as his shaken ideas of the wife's nature, which remained for the rest of the evening. Background understandings and bewilderment. Earlier, the argument was made that the possibility of common understanding does not consist in demonstrated measures of shared knowledge of social structure, but consists instead and entirely in the enforceable character of actions in compliance with the expectancies of everyday life as a morality. Common sense knowledge of the facts of social life for the members of the society is institutionalized knowledge of the real world. Not only does common sense knowledge portray a real society for members, but in the manner of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the features of the real society are produced by persons motivated compliance with these background expectancies. Hence, the stability of concerted actions should vary directly with whatsoever are the real conditions of social organization that guarantee persons' motivated compliance with this background texture of relevances as a legitimate order of beliefs about life in society, seen from within the society. Seen from the person's point of view, his commitments to motivated compliance consist of his grasp of and subscription to the natural facts of life in society. Such considerations suggest that the firmer a societal member's grasp of what anyone like us necessarily knows, the more severe should be his disturbance when natural facts of life are impugned for him as a depiction of his real circumstances. To test this suggestion, a procedure would need to modify the objective structure of the familiar, known in common environment by rendering the background expectancies inoperative. Specifically, this modification would consist of subjecting a person to a breach of the background expectancies of everyday life, while a. making it difficult for the person to interpret his situation as a game, an experiment, a deception, a play, i.e., as something other than the one known according to the attitude of everyday life as a matter of enforceable morality and action. B. Making it necessary that he reconstruct the natural facts, but giving him insufficient time to manage the reconstruction with respect to required mastery of practical circumstances, for which he must call upon his knowledge of the natural facts. And C. Requiring that he manage the reconstruction of the natural facts by himself and without consensual validation. Presumably, he should have no alternative but to try to normalize the resultant incongruities within the order of events of everyday life. Under the developing effort itself, events should lose their perceivedly normal character. The member should be unable to recognize an event's status as typical. Judgments of likelihood should fail him. He should be unable to assign present occurrences to similar orders of events he has known in the past. He should be unable to assign, let alone to see at a glance, the conditions under which the events can be reproduced. He should be unable to order these events to means ends relationships. The conviction should be undermined that the moral authority of the familiar society compels their occurrence. Stable and realistic matchings of intentions and objects should dissolve, by which I mean that the ways, otherwise familiar to him, in which the objective perceived environment serves as both the motivating grounds of feelings and is motivated by feelings directed to it, should become obscure. In short, the member's real perceived environment, on losing its known in common background, should become specifically senseless. Ideally speaking, behaviors directed to such a senseless environment should be those of bewilderment, uncertainty, internal conflict, psychosocial isolation, acute and nameless anxiety, along with various symptoms of acute depersonalization. Structures of interaction should be correspondingly disorganized. This is expecting quite a lot of a breach. This is expecting quite a lot of a breach of the background expectancies. Obviously, we would settle for less if the results of a procedure for their breach was at all encouraging about this formulation. As it happens, the procedure produced convincing and easily detected bewilderment and anxiety. To begin with, it is necessary to specify just what expectancies we are dealing with. Schutz resorted that the feature of a scene, known in common with others, was compound and consisted of several constituents. Because they have been discussed elsewhere, I shall restrict discussion to brief enumeration. According to Schutz, the person assumes that the other person assumes as well, and assumes that as he assumes it of the other person assumes the same for him. 1. That the determinations assigned to an event by the witness are required matters that hold on grounds that specifically disregard personal opinion or socially structured circumstances of particular witnesses, i.e., that the determinations are required as matters of objective necessity or facts of nature. 2. that a relationship of undoubted correspondence is the sanctioned relationship between the presented appearance of the object and the intended object that presents itself in the perspective of the particular appearance. 3. That the event that is known in the manner that it is known can actually and potentially affect the witness and can be affected by his action. 4. That the meanings of events are products of a socially standardized process of naming, reification, and the idealization of the user's stream of experience, i.e., are the products of a language. 5. That present determinations of an event, whatsoever these may be, are determinations that were intended on previous occasions and that may be again intended in identical fashion on an indefinite number of future occasions. 6. That the intended event is retained as the temporally identical event throughout the stream of experience. 7. That the event has its context of interpretation. A commonly entertained scheme of interpretation consisting of a standardized system of symbols, and B. What anyone knows, i.e., a pre-established corpus of socially warranted knowledge. 8. That the actual determinations that the event exhibits for the witness are the potential determinations that it would exhibit for the other person were they to exchange positions. 9. That to each event there corresponds its determinations that originate in the witness's and in the other person's particular biography. From the witness's point of view, such determinations are irrelevant for the purposes at hand of either, and both he and the other have selected and interpreted the actual and potential determinations of events in an empirically identical manner that is sufficient for all their practical purposes. 10. That there is a characteristic disparity between the publicly acknowledged determinations and the personal, withheld determinations of events, and this private knowledge is held in reserve, i.e., that the event means for both the witness and the other more than the witness can say. 11. That alterations of this characteristic disparity remain within the witness's autonomous control. It is not the case that what an event exhibits as a distinctive determination is a condition of its membership in a known in the manner of common sense environment. Instead, the conditions of its membership are the attributions that its determinations, whatever they might substantively consist of, could be seen by the other person if their positions were exchanged, or that its features are not assigned as matters of personal preference but are to be seen by anyone, i.e., the previously enumerated features. These and only these enumerated features, irrespective of any other determinations of an event, define the common sense character of an event. Whatever other determinations and events of everyday life may exhibit, whether its determinations are those of persons' motives, their life histories, the distributions of income in the population, kinship obligations, the organization of an industry, or what goes do when night falls, if and only if the event has for the witness the enumerated determination is it an event in an environment known in common with others. If and only if the event has for the witnesses the enumerated determinations is it an event in an environment known in common with others. Such attributions are features of witnessed events that are seen without being noticed. They are demonstrably relevant to the common sense that the actor makes of what is going on about him. They inform the witness about any particular appearance of an interpersonal environment. They inform the witness as to the real objects that actual appearances are the appearances of, but without these attributed features necessarily being recognized in a deliberate or conscious fashion. Since each of the expectancies that make up the attitude of daily life assigns an expected feature to the actor's environment, it should be possible to breach these expectancies by deliberately modifying scenic events so as to disappoint these attributions. By definition, surprise is possible with respect to each of these expected features. The nastiness of surprise should vary directly with the extent to which the person, as a matter of moral necessity, complies with their use as a scheme for assigning witnessed appearances their status as events in a perceivedly normal environment. In short, the realistic grasp by a collectivity member of the natural facts of life, and his commitment to a knowledge of them as a condition of self-esteem as a bona fide and competent collectivity member, is a condition that we require in order to maximize his confusion upon the occasion that the grounds of this grasp are made a source of irreducible incongruity.